I caught my wife with my best friend, so I took revenge by sleeping with his daughter. But this happened. As I stand here now, reflecting on how I became the man capable of such actions, I find myself thinking about the boy I used to be. Growing up in a small, sleepy town, my world was simple and defined by clear lines of right and wrong. My father, David, was the town's golden standard, a man revered for his integrity, his reliability, and his willingness to lend a hand to anyone in need. People spoke of him with respect, often citing him as a role model. But to me, he wasn't just an honorable man. He was my hero. I idolized him, spending my childhood chasing the example he set, believing that if I could emulate his steadiness and morality, I'd grow into the kind of man others admired, too. That illusion came crashing down in a single, unforgettable moment when I was just 14. I had come home from school earlier than usual that day, eager to grab a snack and settle in with my homework. As I stepped into the house, I found my mother, Elaine, sitting at the kitchen table. At first glance, something seemed off. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, and her eyes were rimmed red, as though she had been crying for hours. Scattered before her were torn envelopes and photographs, the kind you'd see in an old shoebox of forgotten memories. Confusion filled me at first, but then a sense of dread took hold as I realized what those photos meant. The man I had idolized, who preached loyalty and steadfastness, had been living a secret life, a double life. There was another woman, another family, a hidden world he had been keeping from us all. In that moment, everything I had ever known about my father, my family, and even myself crumbled. My mother broke before my eyes, her sobs echoing in a way I can still hear if I let myself linger on the memory too long. She tried to gather the pieces of her heart, but the betrayal was too great, too overwhelming. My father, the man who had stood as the paragon of dependability, barely said a word. He packed his things and left without looking back, as though we were nothing more than an inconvenient chapter in his life he was eager to close. That was the last time I saw him. The man I had once admired so deeply became a phantom, a figure whose shadow haunted me for years. The betrayal etched itself into my soul, carving out a bitterness and mistrust that I vowed would never define me. I swore that I would be different, that I would never inflict the kind of pain my father had caused my mother and me. Loyalty and trust became sacred to me, principles I held onto like a drowning man clinging to a life raft. But no matter how much I tried to distance myself from my father's choices, his betrayal lingered like a ghost in the background of my life. I thought I had outrun it, buried it beneath years of hard work and steadfast commitments. Yet, as life has a way of doing, it brought me full circle. Decades later, I found myself in his shoes, facing a betrayal of my own that mirrored his in ways I never anticipated. By the time I turned 43, I thought I had my life figured out. I had a stable career, a wife of 18 years, and a life that, while not perfect, felt solid. Jenna and I had met when I was in my late 20s, back when I was still optimistic about the world. She had a way of lighting up a room, drawing people in with her charm and effortless warmth. Being with her made me feel like the luckiest man alive, and for a long time, I believed that our marriage, while not without its flaws, was unshakable. Of course, no relationship is perfect. Jenna and I had our fair share of arguments over the years. Bills, work, the usual stressors of life, but I thought our bond was strong enough to weather any storm. Looking back now, it's painfully clear how naive I was. I was blissfully unaware of the cracks forming beneath the surface of our relationship, convinced that we could keep going, no matter what. Then there was Greg. We had been best friends for nearly 20 years, ever since we bonded over the shared misery of our first office jobs. Greg's life had been marked by tragedy. His wife died in a car accident about a decade ago, leaving him to raise their young daughter, Chloe, on his own. Jenna and I had stepped in to help him through those dark times, and over the years, Chloe became like family to us. She spent so much time at our house that it felt like she was our own child, and I had always thought of her as a little sister. But as close as our families had become, That closeness turned out to be the very thing that unraveled everything. That day, when I left work early, I never could have imagined what awaited me at home. Struck by a sharp pain in my stomach, I decided to call it a day and head back to rest. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed Greg's car parked outside. It wasn't unusual for him to stop by unannounced. He often came over to hang out or share a drink, but something about that day felt off. The front door was locked, which was strange because Jenna rarely locked it during the day, especially if we had visitors. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, greeted by an unsettling silence. Usually, when Greg was over, I'd hear them talking or the sound of the TV in the background. But this time, there was nothing, just an eerie, unnatural stillness. As I moved through the house, I caught the faintest of sounds, quiet, muffled noises that sent a chill down my spine. At first, I thought I was imagining things. But as I stood there, straining to listen, the reality of what I was hearing began to sink in. And with it, the foundation of my life crumbled beneath me. I froze at the bottom of the staircase, my body locking in place as my mind struggled to process what my ears were telling me. The muffled sounds drifting down from the bedroom, sounds I recognized but couldn't yet accept, seemed to echo in slow motion. For a moment, I convinced myself I was mistaken, that there was no way this was happening. Yet deep down, something primal told me otherwise. A searing ache bloomed in my chest, a mix of dread and fury that spurred me into action. Without even thinking, I opened the hallway closet and grabbed an old wooden baseball bat, its chipped surface rough under my tightening grip. My mind screamed at me to stop, to think this through, but my body had already made the decision. Each step up the stairs brought the noises into sharper focus, low, intimate moans, breathy gasps, and hushed whispers. By the time I reached the bedroom door, my knuckles were white around the bat, the adrenaline surging through me like a wildfire. I paused for the briefest of seconds, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. Then, with a force I didn't know I possessed, I shoved the door open. What I saw inside obliterated the last shreds of denial I'd been clinging to. There was Jenna, my wife of nearly 2 decades, the woman I had built a life with, entwined with Greg, my so-called best friend. They froze in place, their faces a mask of terror as they realized they'd been caught. Jenna's hair was disheveled, her face flushed with a mix of exertion and panic. Greg scrambled backward on the bed like a cornered animal, his wide eyes darting to the bat in my hand. For a moment, time seemed to stop. I stood there, rooted to the floor, as the scene before me seared itself into my mind. My grip on the bat slackened slightly as I struggled to comprehend the sheer depth of their betrayal. Jenna's mouth opened as though she wanted to explain, but no words came out. Greg, always the coward when it truly mattered, tried to shrink into the mattress as if he could disappear. And then the rage hit me, a volcanic eruption of emotion that obliterated any semblance of rationality. The bat slipped from my hand, clattering to the floor as I lunged toward Greg. My fist connected with his face before I even realized I'd swung it. Then I hit him again. And again. Each punch wasn't just about him. It was an outlet for every ounce of betrayal, humiliation, and heartbreak coursing through me. His grunts of pain only fueled my fury. Jenna screamed, her voice shrill and desperate, as she tried to pull me off him. But I was beyond reason. I wanted them both to feel the weight of what they had done to me, to know the devastation they had caused. How long had this been going on? How could I have been so blind? Questions swirled in my mind like a maelstrom, but none of them mattered in that moment. All that mattered was releasing the fire that was consuming me. When I finally stopped, Greg lay crumpled on the floor, clutching his face. The sight of him, bloodied, pathetic, didn't bring the satisfaction I'd hoped for. I picked up the bat again and stormed out of the bedroom, fury propelling me toward the driveway. Greg's car sat there, an emblem of his audacity. Without hesitation, I swung the bat at the windshield, shattering the glass with a resounding crash. I didn't stop there. Swing after swing, I dented the hood, smashed the mirrors, and cracked the headlights. Each blow was a release, a futile attempt to beat the pain out of my system. When I finally dropped the bat, my arms hung limp at my sides, my chest heaving. I was drenched in sweat, my muscles screaming in protest, but the weight on my chest hadn't lifted. The betrayal still lingered, suffocating me. Without a word, I climbed into my car and drove away, leaving the wreckage behind. I didn't have a destination in mind, just an overwhelming need to escape the house, Jenna, and everything that reminded me of what I'd lost. Somehow, my autopilot led me to the local bar, the one place that had always been my refuge in times of turmoil. When I walked in, clutching the bat like a madman, the bartender, Mike, took one look at me and said nothing. We had known each other for years, and he had an unspoken understanding when it came to men who walked in looking like their world had just ended. He poured me a whiskey and slid it across the counter, without a word. I downed it in one go, the burn in my throat barely registering. By the time I was on my third glass, the alcohol had dulled the edges of my rage, leaving me in a numb haze. I sat there for hours, replaying everything in my mind, the sounds, the sight of them together, the shattered glass. The pain was unbearable, and I couldn't see a way forward. But as I stared into the empty glass in front of me, a new feeling began to take shape. It wasn't just anger, it was something colder, more calculated. They hadn't just hurt me, they had destroyed the foundation of my life. And I wasn't going to let them walk away unscathed. Revenge wasn't just an impulse anymore, it was a necessity. That's when the plan started forming. It wasn't enough to simply leave them behind. I needed to make them feel the same pain, the same humiliation. The thought gave me a twisted sense of purpose, a lifeline to cling to in the chaos. The next morning, the hangover hit me like a freight train. My head throbbed, my stomach churned, but it all paled in comparison to the hollow ache in my chest. I knew I couldn't just sit there wallowing. The first step was clear. I had to end things with Jenna officially. I picked up the phone and called Rick, a divorce lawyer I'd met years ago. Explaining the situation to him was harder than I expected. The words felt like razor blades as I recounted the betrayal, but I held nothing back. Rick was clinical, detached, exactly what I needed. He assured me we'd handle this efficiently and fairly, ensuring Jenna didn't walk away with more than she deserved. For a brief moment, I felt a flicker of relief. At least one part of my life was moving forward, but it didn't last long. As I wandered into the dining room, I spotted Jenna's laptop on the table. She had been working tirelessly on a big presentation for her job, one she had mentioned countless times. It was a career-defining project, something she had poured weeks of effort into. And in that moment, an idea came to me. I wasn't a tech expert, but I didn't need to be. I opened the laptop and scrolled through her files until I found the presentation. For the next few hours, I meticulously sabotaged it, embedding subtle but devastating edits, offensive remarks, inappropriate images, hidden just well enough to evade notice until the presentation itself. She wouldn't see it coming, and her humiliation would be public, just as my betrayal had been. When I finally closed the laptop, I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. It wasn't enough to erase the pain, but it was a start. I sat back and waited, the anticipation gnawing at me as the day of Jenna's presentation loomed closer. That morning, she left the house without so much as a glance in my direction, her silence laced with a quiet arrogance. Jenna had always been confident, too confident, in her ability to twist a situation in her favor, to charm or manipulate her way out of trouble. She probably thought she could somehow smooth things over between us, that her practiced smiles and calculated apologies would suffice. She had no idea what awaited her, no inkling of the chaos I'd set in motion. The hours dragged on as I waited, my mind racing with conflicting emotions. Part of me felt vindicated, knowing that by the time she returned, her life would be irreparably altered. Another part, however, couldn't ignore the hollow ache in my chest. Revenge was satisfying in theory, but in practice, it didn't fill the void. Still, I clung to it as my only source of solace. When Jenna finally came home later that day, I knew immediately that the moment I had been waiting for had arrived. Her face was flushed with anger, her usual polished composure shattered. She stormed through the door, her fury palpable as she hurled accusations at me, her voice trembling with rage. The laptop she once cherished, her prized tool for the career she had spent years building, was now a worthless heap of broken plastic and shattered glass. It lay discarded on the floor, a casualty of her outburst after everything had come crashing down. Jenna didn't need to explain what had happened. The devastation was written all over her face. She had been fired on the spot, humiliated in front of her entire team as the altered presentation unraveled her credibility. The fallout was swift and brutal. In her industry, reputations were everything, and word of her unprofessional behavior spread like wildfire. By the time she walked out of that boardroom, her career wasn't just damaged, it was obliterated. Every door she had worked so hard to open had slammed shut in her face. It was a small victory for me, but it felt monumental in that moment. After everything she had done, the lies, the betrayal, I had finally struck back. For the first time since discovering her infidelity, I felt like I had regained some semblance of control. Of course, I knew it wouldn't fix everything. It wouldn't erase the hurt or mend the pieces of my shattered life. But it was a start. Days turned into weeks, and the house we once called home became a battleground of silence and resentment. Jenna and I barely spoke. There was nothing left to say. The marriage I had once believed to be unbreakable had become a hollow shell of bitterness and regret. She knew forgiveness wasn't on the table, and I knew there was no going back. Every room in the house was a reminder of what we had lost, of what she had destroyed. The air between us was suffocating, thick with tension. Jenna began staying out late, returning only in the early hours of the morning. I didn't ask where she went or who she was with. Frankly, I didn't care anymore. Then one night my phone buzzed. It was well past midnight, and I assumed it was another spam message. But when I glanced at the screen, I saw a name I hadn't expected. Leah, Greg's daughter. Seeing her name gave me pause. She was the last person I anticipated hearing from, especially at such an odd hour. I answered, groggy and disoriented, only to be greeted by her slurred, drunken voice. Leah had been out at a party and needed a ride home. She didn't want to call Greg, afraid of how he'd react, and I suppose she thought I was the only person left she could trust. A part of me hesitated. After everything that had happened with her father, picking her up didn't seem like the wisest choice. But Leah had been like family to me for years, and despite everything, I still felt a sense of responsibility for her. I couldn't just leave her stranded. So I got dressed, grabbed my keys, and drove to the address she had given me. When I arrived, she was leaning against a wall outside the party, barely able to stand. The smell of alcohol was overwhelming as she stumbled into the car, muttering apologies. The ride was quiet at first, the tension between us heavy. But soon, she began talking, her words slurred and disjointed. She told me about her boyfriend, how he had cheated on her, how she felt betrayed and abandoned. Her vulnerability struck a chord in me, a painful reminder of my own wounds. We were both grappling with betrayal, both struggling to navigate the wreckage left by people we trusted. But what happened next was a line I never thought I'd cross. Leah, drunk and emotional, started making advances. At first, I thought she was just seeking comfort, a misplaced attempt to find solace in the chaos of her life. But her actions became more insistent, and my judgment, already clouded by anger, grief, and the whiskey still lingering in my system, failed me. I resisted at first, telling myself this was wrong, but the weight of my emotions drowned out the voice of reason. Between Jenna's betrayal, Greg's disloyalty, and my own desperate need to escape, I gave in. We ended up at a hotel, engaging in something I never thought myself capable of. It was a mistake, a colossal, irreversible mistake, but in that moment, it felt like the only way to reclaim some sense of power, however fleeting. The morning after was sobering in every sense. The weight of what I had done hit me like a freight train. Leah, on the other hand, seemed unbothered. She even suggested taking a picture of us together. For reasons I can't fully explain, I let her. The image, A snapshot of my moral downfall was now saved in my phone, a permanent reminder of how far I had fallen. After dropping Leah off at her house, we didn't talk much. We both knew this was something that needed to stay buried, locked away in the past. But that picture lingered, a ticking time bomb waiting to detonate. Days later, as I sat alone in my empty house, the idea came to me. I had already taken Jenna down, and there was nothing left to salvage between us. But Greg? He still didn't know what had happened. The more I thought about it, the more perfect it seemed. Sending him the picture would destroy not only his relationship with me, but also his bond with Leah. It would be the ultimate revenge, a devastating blow that would mirror the pain I had felt. I stared at my phone, my finger hovering over the send button. Part of me knew this was a step too far, that there would be no coming back from it. But another part, the part consumed by rage and betrayal, pressed on. When Greg received the photo, it didn't take him long to show up at my door. He didn't bother knocking. He stormed in, his face red with fury, his phone clutched in his hand. The confrontation we both knew was inevitable had arrived. He swung at me before I could react, his fist connecting with my jaw. Instinct took over, and I hit back. The fight was raw and messy, fueled by years of resentment and anger. Furniture broke, glass shattered, and by the time we were done, we were both bloodied and exhausted, lying on the floor in silence, staring at the ceiling. The fight with Greg should have been the climax, the final eruption in a saga of betrayal and revenge, but life rarely offers clean resolutions. As we lay there on the shattered remains of my living room, bloodied and panting, the wail of sirens broke the silence. A neighbor, undoubtedly fed up with the noise and chaos, had called the cops. The officers burst in, their commands sharp and unforgiving, pulling Greg and me apart and shoving us out the front door. My adrenaline had burned itself out by then. I didn't resist as they handcuffed me and threw me into the back of a patrol car. Greg didn't fight either. We were both too spent, emotionally, physically, and spiritually, reduced to hollow shells of the men we once were. At the station, they kept us in separate holding cells for a few hours. Neither of us pressed charges. There was no point. By then, we were too broken to keep fighting. When they finally let us go with nothing more than a warning, I returned to an empty house that somehow felt even colder and emptier than before. It wasn't just the absence of Jenna's presence or the remnants of the fight. It was the realization that I had burned every bridge in my life. And yet, in some twisted, inexplicable way, I felt lighter. The weight of anger, of betrayal, of pain I had carried for so long had been unleashed. It hadn't fixed anything, but it had brought me a strange sense of relief. The storm had passed, leaving devastation in its wake, but also clarity. The days that followed were surreal. Jenna and I finalized the divorce with startling efficiency. There was nothing left to fight over. The house was sold, the assets divided, and we went our separate ways. She moved to another city, far enough away that I never had to worry about running into her. I didn't care where she went or what she did. My only concern was putting as much distance as possible between us. For my part, I moved into a modest apartment on the other side of town. It wasn't much, a small, one-bedroom unit in a quiet complex, but it was mine. The walls were bare, the furniture sparse, but it represented a clean slate, untainted by memories of Jenna or the life we had once shared. At first, the silence of the apartment was oppressive. The house I had shared with Jenna had always been filled with noise, arguments, laughter, the mundane sounds of daily life. Now, there was only quiet. The absence of routine, of familiarity, was disorienting. I didn't miss Jenna or Greg, not as individuals, but I missed the structure they had provided. The emptiness of the apartment mirrored the emptiness inside me. Leah, surprisingly, was the one who seemed to move forward with the most resilience. After everything that had happened, I expected her to spiral, to be consumed by the chaos that had engulfed us all. But she surprised me. She moved out of Greg's house, found a job in another city, and began building a life for herself. Occasionally, we exchanged texts or phone calls, but our conversations remained light and casual. Neither of us mentioned the night at the hotel. It was an unspoken agreement, a silent acknowledgement that some things were better left buried. Greg, on the other hand, wasn't as fortunate. His life unraveled rapidly. He and Jenna made a half-hearted attempt to salvage their relationship, clinging to each other in a desperate bid to find some semblance of stability. But a relationship built on lies and betrayal was doomed from the start. They turned to alcohol, numbing themselves to the guilt and regret that consumed them. Their drinking became a nightly ritual, a toxic cycle that only deepened the cracks in their already fractured relationship. It didn't take long for things to escalate. Their arguments grew louder and more volatile, the bitterness between them spilling over into violence. One night, Greg hit Jenna hard enough to send her to the hospital. The incident was the final nail in the coffin of their relationship. Greg went to jail, and Jenna walked away, leaving behind the wreckage of their toxic union. By the time I heard about Greg's downfall, I was too far removed from the situation to feel anything. The revenge I had taken on him and Jenna hadn't brought me happiness or satisfaction. It hadn't fixed anything, but it had allowed me to let go. They were no longer part of my life, and for the first time, I felt free to move on. Moving into the apartment felt like stepping into a new chapter, one defined not by anger or betrayal, but by the quiet possibility of rebuilding. The process was slow and uneven. Some days were easier than others, but the loneliness was a constant companion. It wasn't the kind of loneliness that comes from missing someone. It was the kind that comes from missing a sense of purpose, of direction. I spent hours walking through the nearby parks, trying to find solace in the stillness of nature. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it helped. Eventually, I made a decision that I had been avoiding for far too long. I needed help. The anger, the guilt, the weight of everything I had been carrying, it was too much to bear alone. I decided to see a therapist. Walking into that office for the first time was one of the hardest things I had ever done. It felt like admitting defeat, like acknowledging that I couldn't handle my problems on my own. But it was also a step toward healing. The sessions were difficult. Unpacking everything that had happened, from Jenna's betrayal to the revenge I had taken to the night with Leah, was excruciating. But my therapist didn't judge me. She listened, offering a safe space where I could confront the parts of myself I had been running from. The process was slow, but little by little, I began to feel lighter. The anger that had once consumed me started to fade, replaced by a sense of acceptance. I couldn't change the past, but I could learn to live with it. During this time, I started frequenting the bar where my journey of destruction had begun. Mike, the bartender, had seen me at my worst. He had watched as I spiraled, offering quiet support without prying. One night, after a few drinks, I told him the whole story. I expected judgment, but instead he listened. When I finished, he poured us both another drink and made a joke that caught me off guard. For the first time in months, I laughed. It wasn't a laugh of joy, but one of release, a recognition of the absurdity of life and the way it twists and turns. As the months passed, life began to settle into a new normal. The memories of Jenna, Greg, and Leah lingered, but they no longer held power over me. I had moved beyond revenge, beyond anger, and found a place of quiet acceptance. The apartment, once a symbol of loss, became a sanctuary. I filled it with books, plants, and pieces of myself that had been buried under years of pain. Healing wasn't linear. There were setbacks, moments when the weight of everything threatened to crush me. But I had learned to navigate those moments, to process my emotions, and keep moving forward. Life didn't become perfect, but it became manageable. I rediscovered old hobbies, spent more time outdoors, and began to envision a future untainted by the past. Looking back, I realized that life is messy, unpredictable, and often cruel. But it is also resilient. The revenge I had sought didn't bring me happiness, but it gave me closure. It allowed me to let go of the anger and focus on the future. And in the end, that was what mattered most. The ability to move forward, to rebuild, and to create a life that was truly mine.